You want to know what really messes with your head after 3 years of working the night shift on a power grid. It is not the loneliness. It is not the silence. It is not even the weight of knowing that one wrong move on your part and an entire city goes dark. No. What really messes with your head is when the system tells you everything is perfectly fine. Every dial is steady. Every reading is green. Every load is balanced. And then the lights in your own office flicker anyway. And they flicker in a pattern. And after 6 months of writing it off as a loose bulb or some kind of harmless electrical artifact, you start to realize that the pattern means something. And once you realize that, you can never unrealize it. Stay with me because what I'm about to tell you happened to me, and I need you to hear every single part of it, because the ending is not what you think it is. And by the time we get there, you're going to understand why I no longer work nights, why I no longer live in that city, and why I sleep with every single light in my house turned on. My name does not matter. What matters is the job. I was a power grid operator for a mid-sized city of about 400,000 people. The kind of city that is big enough to have a skyline but small enough that everyone kind of knows everyone in the utility industry. I had been doing this work since I was 24 years old. I started as a meter technician, worked my way up through distribution, spent 2 years in transmission planning, and eventually landed the night shift operator position at the main control center. This was considered a prestigious post. You are essentially the single human being responsible for making sure that 400,000 people wake up in the morning with power, hospitals stay lit, traffic signals stay on, heating systems keep running. Every critical piece of infrastructure in the city depends on you making the right calls between the hours of 10 at night and 6 in the morning. The control room itself was in a building that looked completely unremarkable from the outside. A low concrete structure with a few small windows, tucked behind a chain-link fence with utility company signage on it. Nobody paid it any attention. People drove past it every single day and had no idea that the brain of the entire city's electrical nervous system was sitting right there on the corner of that industrial park. Inside, the room was kept at exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit at all times. Not 67, not 69, 68. The servers and monitoring equipment were sensitive to temperature fluctuations, and so the HVAC system was calibrated almost obsessively to maintain that exact temperature. The lighting in the control room was a very specific shade of cool white, designed to keep operators alert without causing eye strain during long shifts. There were 3 workstations arranged in a gentle arc facing a large display wall that showed the entire grid in real time. Color-coded lines, nodal readings, generation outputs, load demands, everything. During the day shift, there were 3 operators in the room simultaneously. During swing shift, there were 2. On nights, it was just me. This was not unusual in the industry. Night shift demand is predictable. The city sleeps, load drops, the system more or less runs itself, and the operator's primary job is monitoring and responding to anything unexpected. Most nights, nothing unexpected happened. I would sit down at my workstation, review the handoff notes from the swing shift operator, do my initial sweep of all the system readings, pour myself a coffee from the machine in the break room down the hall, and then settle into a rhythm of monitoring. I would check the weather feeds, look at the forecast demand curves for the following morning, maybe read technical documentation or work on my continuing education coursework. Every 30 minutes I would do a formal sweep of all critical parameters and log the readings. It was methodical. It was calm. It was, for the most part, genuinely peaceful. I liked the night shift. I want to be clear about that. I was not someone who dreaded going to work. I chose those hours. I liked being the only person in that building in the early hours of the morning, knowing the city was dark and quiet outside and I was the one keeping the heartbeat going. The first time I noticed the lights flicker was in November. I remember because it was the first really cold night of the year, the kind of cold that comes in suddenly and makes the whole city crank up its heating simultaneously, which always creates interesting demand patterns on the grid. I was sitting at my workstation around 2:30 in the morning, watching the load curve climb steadily as thermostats across the city all kicked on within a short window of time, and I was making small adjustments, bringing additional generation capacity online in a controlled way to match the rising demand. Everything was going exactly as it should. The system was stable. All readings were green. And then the overhead fluorescent lights in the control room flickered, just once. A single brief stutter of the light that lasted maybe half a second, and then everything was normal again. I glanced up at the ceiling, then glanced at my display wall. Nothing had changed on the grid. No anomaly, no spike, no fault. I looked at the building's internal power supply readings. Perfectly stable. I noted it in my personal log as a probable loose bulb or failing ballast in one of the fixtures and moved on. 2 nights later, at almost exactly the same time, 2:47 in the morning, the lights flickered again. Same duration, same single brief stutter. I checked everything again. Grid was stable. Building power was stable. I submitted a maintenance request for the lighting fixtures the following morning when the day shift supervisor came in. He told me he would get facilities to look at it. They came in, checked the fixtures, replaced one of the ballasts that was showing signs of wear, and told me that should fix it. I thanked them and thought nothing more of it, except the flickering did not stop. It continued, roughly every 2 to 3 nights, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always a single brief stutter, and always with no corresponding anomaly anywhere on the grid or in the building's own electrical system. I started keeping more detailed notes. Date, time, duration, all system readings at the moment of occurrence. I brought this to my supervisor's attention again after about 3 weeks of it. He was sympathetic but practical. He said that sometimes lighting anomalies in older buildings are incredibly difficult to trace, that the building's internal wiring was from the 1980s, and there were probably any number of small intermittent faults that would be nearly impossible to find without a complete rewire. He said if it was not affecting operations, it was a low priority item, but he would flag it for the facilities team again. I accepted this explanation. It was reasonable, except then I started noticing something that made it considerably less reasonable. The flickering was not random. I had been logging the exact time of each occurrence, and when I put them all together and laid them out, there was a pattern. Not a rigid, clockwork pattern, not the same time every night, but a pattern in the sense of clustering. The flickers were happening more frequently in the days surrounding specific dates. I went back and cross-referenced those dates with the utility company's historical records, which I had access to as part of my job, and what I found made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. Every single date cluster corresponded to an anniversary of a significant electrical incident in the city's grid history. A substation fire from 1991, a major blackout from 2003, a transformer explosion from 2008 that had injured 2 linemen, a load-shedding event from 2014 that had knocked out power to a significant portion of the hospital district for 11 minutes. These were all real events, documented in the utility company's historical records, and the lights in my control room were flickering on their anniversaries. I want to pause here and acknowledge how this sounds. I know how it sounds. I am an engineer. I deal in data and physical systems and logical causality. I am not, or at least I was not, someone who jumps to supernatural explanations for anything. My first instinct was to find a mundane reason why these dates would cluster together. Maybe the anniversary dates corresponded with particular patterns of seasonal demand, or weather conditions that caused subtle voltage fluctuations in the building's internal system that were too small to register on the monitoring equipment, but just enough to affect the lighting. I spent an entire shift building a spreadsheet analysis to test this hypothesis. The data did not support it. The weather conditions and demand patterns on those dates were not meaningfully different from surrounding dates. There was no environmental variable that explained the clustering, which meant either the clustering was a coincidence, which statistically seemed increasingly unlikely as the pattern repeated over multiple months, or something else was going on that I did not have a framework to understand. Around month 4 of this, I started having trouble sleeping during the day, and I need to tell you that this was new for me. I had been working nights for years and I was an experienced day sleeper. I had blackout curtains, a white noise machine, a consistent sleep schedule. I slept fine, but now I was lying in bed in the middle of the afternoon with this pattern playing over and over in my mind, and I could not let go of it. I started researching the specific incidents I had identified. The substation fire of '91. I found old newspaper accounts. The fire had started at approximately 2:45 in the morning. The grid operator on duty that night, a man who had been with the company for 19 years, had been in the control room when it happened. He had survived but had suffered severe burns to his hands and arms, attempting to manually trip breakers to isolate the fault and prevent a cascade failure. His name was Raymond. I will only use his first name because I do not want to identify his family, but his first name was Raymond, and he had worked the night shift in the same control room where I now worked every single night. I found records of the 2003 blackout. The grid operator on duty had been a man named Harold. The 2008 transformer explosion had resulted in the death of one of the injured linemen, a man named Curtis, who had died in the hospital 3 days after the explosion from complications related to his burns. Curtis had been dispatched from the control room that night by the grid operator on duty, whose name was James. Every single one of these incidents had a night shift operator associated with it. Men who had sat at the same workstation where I now sat, watched the same display wall I now watched, and been on duty when catastrophe struck. None of them were still with the company. Raymond had retired years ago. Harold had left after the 2003 blackout, reportedly never returned to grid operations. James had left the company shortly after Curtis's death, and as far as I could determine had left the utility industry entirely. I tried to find contact information for any of them. This took me several weeks of searching outside of work hours. I eventually found a phone number I believed was associated with Raymond, the man from the '91 fire. I called it. An elderly man answered. When I explained who I was and where I worked and that I was calling about the control room, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then he said, very quietly, "Does it still flicker?" And I felt every hair on my body stand up simultaneously. I said, "Yes." He said, "I know." I said, "Can you tell me what it is?" He said, "I spent 30 years trying to figure that out." I said, "Did you ever find an answer?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the closest I ever came to an explanation was this. He said that building sits on top of something. He said he did not know what. He said he was not a superstitious man and he had spent years looking for a rational explanation and he never found one. He said that the men who work that room on nights, they see things, not just the lights. He said after a while, when you have been there long enough, you start to see things on the display wall that are not in the system. He said it starts with the lights and then it gets worse. He said leave that job. He said, "I am telling you as a fellow professional and as someone who cares about your safety, find another job." And then he said one more thing before he hung up. He said, "Whatever it is that is in that room, it is drawn to the men who have been there when people got hurt. It is drawn to the moment. It wants you to be ready for it, ready for the moment when something goes wrong, and it will practice on you until that moment comes." And then he said goodbye and the call ended. I sat with my phone in my hand in my apartment in the middle of the afternoon sunlight streaming through my window, and I was not afraid exactly. I was something past afraid. I was in a state of extremely clear-eyed, calm, cold terror. The kind that does not make you scream. It makes you very, very still and very, very quiet. Like prey, I went back to work that night. And the night after that. I am not entirely sure why. Partly stubbornness, partly professional obligation. Partly, if I am being honest, a kind of morbid need to see where it was going. I had been trained my entire career to investigate anomalies, to not look away from the data, to follow the pattern to its conclusion. And this was the most compelling pattern I had ever encountered. The next development happened 6 weeks after my call with Raymond. It was a Thursday morning about 3:15. I was doing my routine sweep. Everything stable, city sleeping, load curves perfectly nominal. And then I looked up at the display wall during a moment when I was not consciously focusing on anything in particular, just letting my eyes rest on it, and I saw something on the display that was not there a moment before. A fault indicator. A red fault marker on a transmission line in the northeast quadrant of the city. I sat forward immediately, completely alert. I checked the system log. There was no fault recorded. I checked the line's readings directly. Voltage, current, all nominal. No fault. The red marker was gone. I rubbed my eyes. I went and splashed cold water on my face in the break room. I came back and the display was exactly as it should be. I sat down and logged the incident. Possible visual artifact or fatigue-induced hallucination. 3:17 a.m. IT happened again 5 nights later. Same quadrant, slightly different line. A fault marker that appeared for approximately 4 seconds and then was gone, with no corresponding entry in the system log and no anomalous readings on the affected equipment. And again, I logged it and I called it a visual artifact, because that was the rational explanation. I was not sleeping well. Night shift workers are statistically more prone to visual disturbances. It was nothing, except then it happened on a night when I was not tired at all. I had slept 8 solid hours before my shift. I had eaten well, I had exercised, I had consumed a moderate amount of caffeine and not too much. I was alert and fresh and functioning at full capacity. And at 3:42 in the morning, I watched a cascade of fault markers appear across the northeast quadrant of my display wall, like a string of red lights being switched on one by one, covering 7 separate transmission lines and 3 distribution substations, in a pattern that I recognized immediately as the precursor to a major localized blackout event. I was out of my chair and moving to the emergency protocols before the rational part of my brain caught up with the animal part. I had my hand on the phone to call the emergency dispatch line, and then I looked at the readings. Everything was fine. Every single one of those lines and substations was reading perfectly normal. No fault anywhere. The display wall was clear. No red markers. I stood there with my hand on the phone, breathing hard, completely alone in a 68-degree room at 3:42 in the morning, and the lights flickered. Long this time, not a half-second stutter. A full 3 count of dimming and flickering before they came back to full brightness. And in the dimness, in those 3 seconds, I thought I saw something in the corner of the room. A shape. A person-shaped shadow that was not cast by anything in the room. And then the lights were back and there was nothing there. I finished my shift. I drove home in the gray pre-dawn light. I sat at my kitchen table and I thought for a long time. And then I called my supervisor and I told him I was putting in my notice. He was surprised. He asked if everything was okay. I said yes. He asked if it was a compensation issue or if I had received another offer. I said no, I just needed to make a change. He accepted this graciously, wished me well, and that was that. But before I left on my last shift, I did something I had been thinking about for weeks. I went into the utility company's archived records room, which was in the basement of the control building, and I searched for any documentation related to the history of the building itself. Not the grid history, the building history. And I found something in a folder of miscellaneous facility documents that I think about every single day. A memo, dated June of 1983, from a facilities engineer to the operations director. The memo stated that during the initial construction of the control building, workers had discovered what appeared to be remnants of a significantly older structure beneath the foundation. The memo described the workers as being reluctant to continue work and noted that 2 workers had quit without giving notice after working in the area where the old foundation was found. The memo recommended bringing in a structural assessor to evaluate whether the old foundation would affect the integrity of the new building's construction. There was a handwritten note in the margin of the memo, in different handwriting, that said, "Assessed, no structural impact, proceed." And that was all. No further documentation, no record of what the old structure had been, no record of how old it was or what had happened there. I stood in that basement archive room in the yellow light of a single overhead bulb, and I held that memo and I understood that I was done. I photocopied it, put the original back in its folder, and walked out of that building for the last time. I live in a different city now. I work day shift. I have a new position in grid planning that involves almost no time in control rooms. I sleep at night like a normal person, and most of the time I am fine. Except that every now and then, usually when I am sitting quietly doing something mundane, my mind goes back to that display wall with its false fault markers, and I wonder whether the room was practicing. Whether it was rehearsing with me, showing me what it wanted me to see, getting me ready for a moment that it had already decided would come. And I wonder about whoever is sitting in that room right now, at 3 in the morning, watching the lights flicker, telling themselves it is a loose bulb and a tired brain. And I hope they listen to what Raymond told me, earlier than I did. I hope they leave before the practice session ends and the real event begins. Because I am here to tell you that the most frightening thing I have ever encountered in my professional life was not a fault, not a blackout, not a fire. It was a room that knew something I did not. And it was very, very patiently waiting for the right moment to show me what it knew. Story number 2. Before you write off what I am about to tell you as the product of sleep deprivation, or the imagination of a man who has spent too many years working alone in the basement of a building where people come to die, I want you to consider this. I have been a stationary engineer for 22 years. I have maintained boilers, chillers, air handling units, emergency generators, and every complex mechanical system in between. I have worked in factories, in universities, in high-rise office buildings, and for the last 9 years in a hospital. I understand machines the way some people understand language. I know what things are supposed to sound like, feel like, smell like. When a machine is healthy and when it is not. I know the difference between a sound that has an explanation and a sound that does not. And what I am about to tell you is about sounds that did not have explanations. And what those sounds eventually led me to find in a part of the hospital basement that I was not supposed to be in, at 4 in the morning, in a corridor that did not appear on any of the facility schematics I had ever been given. Stay with me until the end of this, all the way to the end, because the last thing I found is the thing I cannot explain, and I need someone to hear it. My shift starts at 10 p.m. and ends at 6 a.m. I am the only stationary engineer on site during those hours. There is a maintenance technician on call who can be reached by radio, but for routine operations, the building is mine. My primary responsibility is the steam plant. The hospital I work at in Houston still runs on a centralized steam distribution system. This is older technology, but it is extremely reliable, which is why many large institutional buildings, particularly hospitals, have kept it long after newer facilities move to hot water systems. Steam is generated in large fire tube boilers in the basement plant room, and then distributed through a network of insulated pipes to heat exchangers throughout the building, where it provides space heating, sterilization for surgical equipment, kitchen operations, and laundry. My job is to keep those boilers running, maintain proper operating pressure, monitor water chemistry, manage blowdowns, and respond immediately to any fault in the system. The plant room is in the deepest part of the basement, and it is a remarkable space in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has never been inside one. The boilers themselves are large, larger than most people imagine, each one roughly the size of a delivery truck, covered in insulation and valve assemblies and pressure gauges and safety equipment. The room is hot, always hot, even in the Houston summer when the ambient temperature outside is already brutal. It is loud with the constant low roar of combustion and the hiss of steam and the clicking and cycling of burner controls and feed water pumps. There is a particular smell to a boiler room, a combination of combustion gases and hot metal, and the slightly mineral smell of treated boiler water that I have come to associate so strongly with my work that if I encounter it anywhere else, it immediately makes me alert and professional in the way that a soldier might snap to attention at the sound of a bugle. It is the smell of my domain. I know every corner of that room the way you know the rooms of the house you grew up in. I know which pipes tick when they expand and which ones are silent. I know the sound of each individual burner cycling, the particular rhythm of each pump. I know the normal. What I am about to tell you started about 3 years into my time at this hospital, which means it has been going on for 6 years now. The first thing I noticed was not a sound I heard with my ears. It was a sound I felt in my chest, a very low, sub-bass vibration that I could not locate. Not the normal vibration of the boilers, which I felt constantly through the floor but had long since stopped consciously registering. This was different in frequency and in pattern. It was rhythmic but not mechanical, not the steady cycling of a pump or the periodic firing of a burner. It was irregular in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. Slow, deep, somewhat variable breathing, like a sleeping animal. I walked the entire plant room checking every piece of equipment looking for the source. Nothing I found accounted for it. I checked the pipe connections, the expansion joints, the pump bases, looking for anything loose or misaligned that might produce an unusual vibration. Everything was tight and in order. I made a note of it and continued my rounds. It came back the following night, around the same time between 3:30 and 4 in the morning. Same quality, same uncomfortable biological rhythm. I spent almost an hour on my hands and knees in that boiler room with my hand pressed to the floor trying to feel where the vibration was strongest, and therefore where it was coming from. The result of this investigation was strange. The vibration seemed to be strongest not near any of the boilers or mechanical equipment, but in the far corner of the plant room, near a wall. A concrete wall that I had always assumed was an exterior wall or a structural wall behind which was simply earth or foundation concrete. But as I pressed my palm flat against it and felt that low rhythmic thrum moving through the concrete and into my hand, the thought came to me, uninvited and unpleasant, that there was something on the other side of that wall, something that was breathing. I want to reiterate because I think it is important that I am not a dramatic person. I am not someone who entertains fanciful ideas easily. I have a certification from the National Institute for the Uniform Licensing of Power Engineers. I am licensed to operate high-pressure boilers in the state of Texas. I have been drug tested randomly for 22 years, and I do not drink during the work week. I am the most boring and practical human being I know. And I stood in front of that wall in my boiler room at 3:47 in the morning and had the completely clear and lucid thought that something was breathing behind it. And then I went back to my workstation and drank my coffee and logged the vibration anomaly and did not think about it again for the rest of that shift. Over the following weeks, two additional things happened. The first was that the sounds expanded. Not just the sub-bass vibration, but actual audible sounds that were coming from somewhere beyond that wall. Not loud, not obvious. If you were in the plant room and the boilers were running, you would not hear them. But there were moments during a shift, usually in the deepest part of the night, when the burners on all three boilers would be in their off cycle simultaneously. The feed pumps would be quiet, and in that brief mechanical silence, which in a working boiler room is quite rare, you could hear something. A sound that I can only describe as a low, resonant, human-adjacent moan. Not a cry, not a scream. A sustained, deep, sorrowful sound that went on for several seconds and then stopped. I heard it for the first time on a Tuesday morning in February, and I stood completely still for a solid minute after it ended, every muscle in my body locked, my coffee mug halfway to my mouth. And then the burners cycled back on and the mechanical world reasserted itself, and I stood there in the roar and heat and told myself I had imagined it. I had not imagined it. Because the second thing that happened was that I started talking to some of the other night shift hospital staff during our overlap periods. Not about what I was hearing, not specifically, but I started asking general questions about the history of the building. And what I learned, pieced together from conversations with a couple of the older nursing staff and one of the security officers who had been there for 15 years, was that the hospital building had been significantly expanded and renovated in the 1970s, and that the original structure, built in the 1930s, had included a wing that had been sealed off and incorporated into the foundation during the renovation, rather than demolished. Nobody seemed to know exactly why it had been sealed rather than torn down, but the security officer said he had heard, from someone who had worked there before him, that the original wing had included a long-term psychiatric care ward. He said this completely casually, just a piece of institutional history, while we were both getting coffee at 2 in the morning, and I nodded and acted as though this was merely interesting trivia, and then I went back to my plant room and looked at that wall. The second thing that happened, the one that made everything worse, occurred about a month later. I need to tell you about the schematic. The facility has detailed engineering drawings for all of the building systems, maintained in a cabinet in my office area in the basement. Piping diagrams, electrical schematics, HVAC layouts, structural plans. I use these regularly in my work. I had been using them for 9 years. I knew them well, or thought I did. On a slow night when I had completed all my rounds ahead of schedule, I was sitting at my desk going through the piping schematics to plan for some preventive maintenance work, and I pulled out the full basement-level floor plan to trace the steam distribution headers. I was following a line across the drawing when I noticed something I was absolutely certain I had never noticed before, despite having referenced this drawing dozens if not hundreds of times. On the far left margin of the drawing, partially obscured by the fold of the paper, there was a room marked. Not a room I had ever been in, not a room I had ever seen referenced anywhere in my 9 years at this facility. It was labeled in the small technical lettering of an engineering drawing as Sub-Basement Corridor B, and it had a door, marked on the drawing, that was located behind a section of shelving in the facility's main basement storage area. I sat with that drawing for a long time. I traced every line of it, and I found two things that troubled me deeply. First, Sub-Basement Corridor B was directly adjacent to the wall in my boiler room behind which I had been hearing the breathing and the moaning. Second, on the drawing, faintly, in pencil rather than in the standard ink of the engineering documentation, someone had written two words at the entrance to Corridor B. The words were "Do not." That is all. Just those two words. Do not. No following instruction. No clarifying text. Just a warning that was incomplete and therefore somehow more frightening than any complete warning could have been. Do not what? Do not enter. Do not look. Do not open. Do not go alone. Do not go at all. I do not know. But someone, at some point, had looked at that drawing and felt compelled to write those two words in pencil before apparently deciding against completing the thought. And that penciled fragment of a warning had sat in that engineering drawing cabinet for however many decades since, and nobody had ever done anything about it. It took me 2 more weeks to go looking for the door. During those 2 weeks, I told myself I was not going to go. I told myself that whatever was in Corridor B was not my concern, that my job was the boilers and the steam system, that I had no professional reason to access a space that was not on my maintenance rounds and was not part of any system I was responsible for. I told myself all of this very firmly and very clearly. And then, at 4:15 in the morning on a Thursday in March, I found myself in the main basement storage area moving shelving units to look for a door. It was there. Behind a heavy steel shelving unit that was loaded with boxes of facility supplies, floor cleaning chemicals, paper goods, the kind of mundane storage that fills the forgotten corners of institutional buildings. Behind it was a door. A heavy steel door with no window, secured by a simple lever-style handle that was not locked. The door was old. The steel was pitted and stained in a way that was consistent with decades of exposure to the particular damp of a below-grade space. The door frame was slightly swollen with moisture, and when I pulled the handle down and leaned against the door, it resisted for a moment before giving way with a sound that I can only describe as a deep structural exhale, as though the building itself had been holding its breath. The corridor beyond was dark. I had my maintenance flashlight, a good powerful LED light that I always carried on my rounds. I shone it into the corridor. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a low ceiling with exposed pipes running along it, which I recognized immediately as part of the original building's steam distribution system, now defunct and presumably long depressurized. The corridor ran straight for what looked like 30 or 40 feet before turning. The air that came out of it was cool, cooler than the boiler room behind me, and had a smell that was old and damp and something else, something faintly organic that I did not want to try to identify. I went in. I want to be clear about something. I was not being reckless. I had my radio. I had my phone. I had my flashlight. I had told the on-call maintenance technician when I had radioed at the beginning of the shift that I would be doing some investigation of an anomalous pipe vibration in the basement storage area. So if I had not responded to a radio check within the next hour, he would have known to send someone. I was as prepared as I could reasonably be. And I am also telling you this because I want you to understand that what I saw in that corridor was seen by a prepared, sober, experienced, professionally competent person, not someone who stumbled into a dark place unprepared and spooked themselves. The corridor turned after about 40 feet and opened into a series of rooms. The rooms had clearly been part of the sealed psychiatric ward that the security officer had mentioned. There were old metal bed frames still in some of them, stripped of everything else but the frames bolted to the wall in a configuration that told you immediately these had been institutional beds, not the kind you can reposition. There were porcelain fixtures in what had been a communal bathroom, now gray with age and mineral deposits. There were a few pieces of old furniture, a wooden chair in one room, a metal desk in another. Everything was heavily coated in dust and in a fine dark moisture deposit that comes from decades in a sealed, poorly ventilated below-grade space. It was a time capsule of an era of medical practice that the institution had apparently preferred to literally bury rather than acknowledge. And then I came to the room at the end of the corridor. And the room at the end of the corridor was different from all the others. It was different because it was not empty. Not entirely. In the center of the room on the floor was a low, heavy wooden cabinet. Very old. The kind of heavy joinery that was done before particle board and MDF existed. Thick solid wood panels with dovetail joints. It was dark with age and the moisture in the air. It was roughly the size of a large chest freezer but taller. More of a cabinet shape with two doors on the front held closed by a simple hasp latch. And there were sounds coming from it. I stood in the doorway of that room with my flashlight on the cabinet and I listened. And what I heard was the sound I had been hearing through the wall of my boiler room for 3 years. That low, rhythmic, breathing-adjacent vibration, coming from inside the cabinet. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. I thought about everything I have already told you, about the sealed ward, about the penciled warning on the engineering drawing, about the nursing staff talking about patients from the old building, about the security officer and his institutional history, and I thought about the fact that I was alone at 4 a.m. in a sealed corridor that should not exist, looking at a cabinet that was making sounds that I did not have an explanation for. I did not open the cabinet. I want to be honest with you about that. I walked to within about 6 feet of it. I shone my light on the hasp latch. The hasp was not padlocked, just a simple metal bar that dropped into a staple to hold the doors shut. I could have opened it. My hand actually moved toward it, and then the breathing from inside it changed. It got faster, and there was a second sound, a sound that I am going to try to describe accurately, even though the accurate description is deeply, deeply unpleasant. It was a sound like something inside the cabinet became aware that I was there. Like something that had been sleeping or dormant came alert, and the low rhythmic sound shifted into something that had direction, something that had intention, something that was orienting toward me. I left that corridor faster than I have ever moved in my professional life. I pulled the door shut behind me. I moved the shelving back in front of it. I went to my workstation, sat down, and shook for approximately 20 minutes. Then I did the rest of my shift. I logged a boiler water chemistry check and a routine pressure gauge inspection in the times I had actually been exploring the corridor, because I was not going to try to explain to anyone what I had actually been doing. When my relief came in at 6 a.m., I told him everything was fine, have a good shift, and I left. I have worked every shift since then in full knowledge that behind the wall of my boiler room, behind a door behind a shelf, at the end of a corridor that does not appear on the official facility schematics, there is a cabinet that breathes, and whatever is in that cabinet knows I was there. I can tell you this with confidence because the sounds changed after that night. They used to be just the background rhythm, the breathing sound, ambient and almost reassuring in a horrible way. Now in the silent moments between burner cycles, the sound has something else in it. Something that pauses when I am near that wall, something that seems to listen, something that I am almost certain has started to wait. I have never gone back to that corridor. I have also never told anyone at the hospital about what I found. I have not told my supervisor. I have not told facilities management. I have told no one except you right now. And the reason I am telling you is not because I want someone to investigate it. It is because I have worked in that boiler room every night for 9 years, and whatever is in that cabinet has been there far longer than I have. And I have come to the conclusion that the penciled warning on the engineering drawing was not an instruction to stay away for safety reasons, or for legal reasons, or for any practical institutional reason. I think it was written by someone who had already opened the cabinet. Someone who had already heard what I heard when I stood 6 feet from it and the breathing changed. Someone who was trying in the only way they could to warn the next person who found the drawing. Do not, just those 2 words. And I finally understand exactly what they mean. Do not go there. Do not open it. Do not let it know that you know it is there. Because once you do, it never stops listening for you. Story number 3. There is a specific kind of cold that you only find in Antarctica. Not the cold of a winter morning in Chicago or a February night in Minnesota. Those are cold in the way that a slap is painful, sharp and immediate and unpleasant, but ultimately survivable. Antarctic cold is different. It is cold in the way that the ocean is deep. It does not just surround you, it penetrates you. It works its way into the spaces between your cells. It gets inside your thinking. And when you are standing in a blizzard at 2 in the morning, 60 kilometers per hour winds driving snow horizontally across the ice shelf, and your breath is freezing on your face mask as it exits your mouth, creating a layer of ice between the mask and your skin that you have to break away every few minutes because it is beginning to restrict the mask to your face. You stop thinking in terms of discomfort. You start thinking in terms of time. How much time do you have before the cold wins? Before the margin between you and the ice becomes too small to measure? That is the headspace I was in on the night I need to tell you about. And what happened in that headspace, what I encountered out there on the ice, is what I am here to tell you. Hear me out to the very end, because the ending of this story is not a resolution. It is something much harder to sit with than a resolution. It is an open question that I have been carrying for 3 years now, and I suspect I will carry it for the rest of my life. My name is not important. My job title is Electrical Power Generation Technician at a research station in Antarctica. I am going to be deliberately vague about the specific station, because the events I am going to describe were never officially reported, and I have no interest in creating professional or institutional complications for a station and a program that I have a great deal of respect for. What I can tell you is that this is a real operational research station, that it is staffed year-round by a rotating crew of scientists and support personnel, and that during the winter-over period when I was there, our total population was roughly 31 people. 31 human beings on a continent of ice, in the polar darkness, several hundred miles from the nearest other human settlement. My specific role was maintaining the station's electrical generation system. The station ran on 3 diesel generators arranged in a parallel configuration, with a 4th generator available as emergency backup. These generators provided all power for the station: heating, lighting, science equipment, communication systems, life safety systems, everything. Without the generators, the station would begin to lose heat within hours. In Antarctic winter conditions, loss of heat is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence that merely takes a few days to complete execution. The generators were, without exaggeration, the single most critical piece of infrastructure at the station. My job was to ensure they kept running. Period. That was the job. Everything else was secondary. The station's power plant was a separate building connected to the main station by a covered access corridor that was itself heated, though not generously. The power plant building was small, functional, noisy, and warm because the generators produced significant waste heat that was captured and used to supplement the station's heating system. I had a workstation in the plant, monitors showing generator outputs, fuel consumption, cooling temperatures, exhaust back pressure, everything. My night shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., was typically quiet in terms of mechanical events. The generators ran at a steady load determined by the station's operational needs, which were reduced during sleeping hours. My primary tasks were monitoring, performing scheduled maintenance inspections, logging fuel consumption, and responding to any alarms. The station had rules. Every Antarctic station has rules, and these rules are not the kind of bureaucratic box checking that you find in a normal workplace. These rules were written in the understanding that the margin between okay and catastrophic at a remote Antarctic station is measured in minutes during a weather event. The rules were serious, and everyone who worked there treated them as such. Rule 1, and the one most relevant to what I am about to tell you, was the blizzard protocol. If conditions deteriorated to blizzard level, defined as sustained winds above 50 kilometers per hour with visibility below 30 meters, no personnel were to be outside the covered station infrastructure for any reason without a partner and without supervisor authorization. No exceptions. The reasoning was simple. In a whiteout blizzard at these temperatures, a person who loses their orientation outdoors does not wander and eventually find their way back. A person who loses their orientation in those conditions has a survival window measured in single-digit minutes. The rules also had some informal additions that were passed down from crew to crew through oral tradition rather than written documentation. These informal rules were treated with equal seriousness by the experienced winter-over personnel. One of them, and the one I need to tell you about, was this. If you are working the night shift in the power plant during a blizzard and you hear a knock at the exterior door of the plant building, do not open it. Radio the main station first, verify whether any personnel are unaccounted for, and only open the door if someone is confirmed missing. If everyone is accounted for, radio the station leader, log the event, and do not open the door. I want to pause and tell you about this rule specifically, because understanding it is important to understanding everything that follows. When I started my first winter-over season, one of the veteran technicians explained this rule to me during my orientation. I asked why. He said because it happens. I said what happens. He said people hear knocking. I said from what? He said that is the question that nobody has ever been able to answer, and the people who have opened the door to find out have never been able to tell us the answer either, because they have not been in a state to tell us anything coherent afterward. I asked what that meant. He said one guy, 3 seasons back, heard knocking during a blizzard, opened the door, and they found him sitting on the floor of the power plant 4 hours later with all his cold weather gear still on, completely unable to speak, completely unresponsive, staring at the closed door. He spent 3 days like that. When he came back to himself, he said he did not remember anything after opening the door. He was medically evacuated as soon as conditions permitted. He never came back to the program. I filed this information away in the same mental category I used for all the other informal station rules. Important, take seriously, do not test. And for the first 4 months of my winter over, I did not have occasion to think about it again. The season was smooth. The generators ran well. I had 2 small mechanical issues. A cooling hose fitting that developed a minor leak, and a fuel filter that needed replacing ahead of schedule, both straightforward and handled easily within normal operating parameters. The winter darkness settled over us, and we all adapted to it in the particular psychological way that Antarctic winter-over people adapt, which is to say you build your world out of the walls around you. You fill the darkness with work and routine and human connection, and you choose, consciously and deliberately, not to think too hard about what is out there on the ice beyond the station's perimeter lights. The blizzard that is central to this story arrived on a Tuesday in the deep middle of the winter. It had been forecast, and the station leader had been monitoring the weather models for several days as the system organized and intensified. By the time I started my shift at 10 p.m., conditions were already at 58 kilometers per hour with gusts above 80 and temperature with wind chill at approximately minus 65 Celsius. I want you to hold that number. Minus 65 degrees Celsius with wind chill. Water freezes on contact with a surface at those temperatures. Exposed skin develops frostbite in under 2 minutes. Breath, as I mentioned, freezes on a face mask as it exits. This is the environmental context of what I am about to tell you. My first 2 hours on shift were occupied almost entirely with generator management. The blizzard conditions were creating power demand spikes as the station's heating system worked harder to maintain internal temperature against the assault of the storm outside. I was running 2 generators at higher load than usual and had the third generator on standby rather than at its usual maintenance off-cycle. I was monitoring fuel consumption carefully because a prolonged blizzard combined with elevated load meant I needed to be attentive to my remaining fuel inventory and plan resupply logistics accordingly. I was busy in a technical sense, but not stressed. This was exactly the kind of situation my training had prepared me for, and the equipment was performing well. At approximately 2 in the morning, during a brief lull in the demand fluctuations while I was updating my fuel consumption log, I heard the knock. I need to try to describe it accurately because the quality of the sound matters to the story. It was not a single knock. It was a pattern. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, then a pause, then 3 more. The pattern repeated twice. It was deliberate. It was communicative. It had the cadence of someone who knew how to knock on a door to signal that they needed to be let in. It was completely, utterly human sounding. And it was coming from the exterior door of the power plant, which opened directly onto the outside, onto the ice, into a blizzard where the wind chill was minus 65 Celsius. I was out of my chair before I had consciously processed what I was hearing. My hand was reaching for my jacket, which was hanging beside my workstation, because the reflexive human response to someone knocking at a door in distress is to open it. And then my training caught up with my instincts. I stopped. I did not touch the door. I went to my radio. I called the main station. I told the night watch person, a science technician named Yuki who had the station comms during night hours, that I was hearing knocking at the exterior door of the power plant and I needed a personnel count. She did not ask questions. She just said, "Give me 2 minutes." I stood by the door during those 2 minutes and listened to the knocking continue. 3 and 3, 3 and 3, perfectly even, perfectly patient. Whatever was out there in a minus 65 Celsius blizzard was not panicking. It was knocking steadily and evenly like someone who had all the time in the world. Yuki came back on the radio in 90 seconds. She said all personnel accounted for. 31, all in station. No one in power plant corridor. I confirmed this meant I was the only person in the power plant building. She confirmed. I said understood and I am not opening the door. She said correct, log the event and contact the station leader in the morning. I said acknowledged. I logged the event. Exterior door knock, power plant building, 02:14 hours blizzard conditions. Personnel count confirmed 31 of 31 present in main station. Door not open per blizzard protocol. That was the log entry. Simple, factual, professional. The knocking continued for exactly 47 minutes. I know this because I was watching the clock. It did not change pattern or tempo for any of that time. 3 and 3, steady, patient, unvarying. At the 48-minute mark, it stopped. Completely. No fade, no final irregular knock, just stop. As though whatever had been doing it had simply decided to cease. I sat at my workstation and stared at the door for the remaining 3 hours and 45 minutes of my shift. I was not afraid exactly. I was in the same state I described to you at the beginning of this story, the state of being very clear and very still and very aware of the margin between being okay and not being okay. I drank my thermos of coffee methodically. I did my generator checks on schedule. I logged my parameters. When my relief came at 6 a.m., a mechanical engineer named Torben, who was the most practical and unflappable Scandinavian I have ever met, I told him calmly what had happened. He nodded. He said, "It happens." He said, "How long did it go?" I said, 47 minutes. He said, "That is on the longer side." I said, "What is the longest you have heard of?" He said, "One of the seasons before I first came down, they had it for 3 hours. I asked what happened. He said, "What always happens." It stopped eventually. I asked if he had ever opened the door. He looked at me steadily and said no. I said, "Smart." He shrugged and said, "The rule is the rule." I went asleep in my bunk in the main station, and I lay there in the polar darkness and thought about the knocking. 3 and 3, 3 and 3, patient as stone. And I thought about the fact that at minus 65 Celsius, anything biological that was out there in the open would have been dead within minutes of exposure. Nothing survives those conditions outside of shelter. Nothing that I know of. Nothing that has a name. And I thought about what the veteran technician had told me during orientation, about the man who had opened the door, who had sat unresponsive on the floor for 4 hours and could not remember what he had seen. And I thought about what it would take to sit in a blizzard at the bottom of the world, in conditions that kill exposed flesh in minutes, and knock on a door for 47 minutes. What manner of patience that would require. What manner of being. I worked 3 more months at that station. The knocking came back once more, about 6 weeks later during another significant weather event. That time it lasted about 20 minutes and then stopped. I followed the protocol exactly as I had before. I heard it from 2 other crew members as the winter progressed, both of whom had similar experiences, knocking at various exterior access points of the station complex during blizzard conditions. Personnel always fully accounted for. Door never opened. We talked about it among ourselves in the way that people talk about things they have decided to accept without explanation, because the alternative is a kind of existential destabilization that is not compatible with functioning professionally in an extreme environment. We talked about it matter-of-factly. We gave it no more emotional weight than we gave to equipment malfunctions or weather forecasts. It was a thing that happened at this station, like the particular quality of light during astronomical twilight at the edge of the winter season, beautiful and inexplicable, and not requiring an explanation to be real. But I want to tell you the thing that I have not been able to make matter of fact, the thing that I still lie awake and think about. In the weeks after the first knocking event, I was doing a routine inspection of the exterior of the power plant building during a calm period, checking the building envelope for any ice accumulation that might block ventilation or exhaust ports, which was a regular maintenance task. I was outside in full cold weather gear, properly equipped, during acceptable conditions. And when I came around to the side of the building where the exterior door was, I looked down at the snow around it. and I saw marks. The Antarctic wind erases most surface features quickly, but there had been a period of relative calm after the blizzard that had preserved the surface longer than usual. And in the snow in front of that exterior door, there were marks, not footprints. I want to be very precise about this. Not anything that I could categorize as footprints made by a booted human foot. The marks were there, and they were in the location where something would need to stand to knock on that door, and that is all I can tell you about them. They were not footprints, and they were not made by any animal I have ever been able to identify, and I have subsequently looked, carefully and systematically, through every available reference for Antarctic wildlife. The continent hosts a limited range of species, none of which venture this far inland, and none of which would make marks of that configuration. I photographed them. I have those photographs. I have shown them to 3 people I trust, and all 3 of them have had the same response, a long silence followed by the observation that they do not know what made those marks. I have not shown them to anyone else, and I do not intend to. I have also not opened that exterior door, which I know is not possible now that I am home and the door is on a different continent entirely. But I have thought many times about the man who did open a door, who sat unresponsive for 4 hours and came back to himself not knowing what he had seen. And I have thought about whether the knocking was actually a request, whether whatever stood outside that door in the deepest Antarctic blizzard I have ever worked through was actually asking for something, and whether the answer to what it was asking for was the same thing that every presence knocking at a door in the dark ultimately wants: to be let in, to be seen, to be known, to cross the threshold from outside to inside, from cold to warm, from the dark to the light. And what I come back to every time I think about it, every time I lie awake with those 47 minutes of 3 and 3 playing in the back of my mind, is this: whatever it was patient. It knocked for 47 minutes in conditions that should make anything stop. It had been doing this long enough that the station had a rule for it. Long enough that multiple experienced people had heard it across multiple seasons. Long enough that the rule was part of the oral tradition passed from crew to crew as essential operational knowledge. It had been there longer than any of us. It will be there after all of us are gone. And it will keep knocking, 3 and 3, steady and patient as the ice itself, waiting for the one person who does not know the rule, or knows it and does not believe it, or knows it and believes it but opens the door anyway just to know, just to finally know. And that person, whoever they are, whatever season they work, whatever they see when they open that door, will not be able to tell us what they found, because nobody who has opened it ever has.